In Lecture 4, we will be discussing ethics and regulatory developments. When you talk about regulatory developments around the world, it's always a response to a crisis. So the way that the system works is that there are bubbles, and eventually the bubble bursts, which leads to a crisis. So the 2007 crisis was not the first financial crisis, and it definitely won't be the last, but we want to ensure that we've learned from some of our mistakes so that we can mitigate the risk better. So the Financial Stability Board is a global organization, and it tries to build the resilience of banks. It tries to make banks stronger. It doesn't want any firm in a position where they are, for example, too big to fail, because if a firm is too big to fail, they know that the government will not allow them to fail. They will be bailed out in the event that they are coming close to a failure. This causes a moral hazard problem. So this firm that knows that they're too big to fail will make all these mistakes because they know at the end of the day they will be bailed out. With shadow banking and the OTC derivative markets, there is legislation coming into effect now. We will have to wait and see the impact of the legislation and if it actually does what it sets out to do, so that is still to be seen. When we look at ethics in financial markets, ethics is a difficult thing to deal with because how do you ensure that everybody that you're dealing with has an ethical culture? So you cannot make sure that every person is a good person in your firm, but what you can do is you can follow a good ethical culture. And if that culture is seen in the firm, people will generally act in the same way. So, for example, if you have a CEO that has good ethics and makes sure that they are helping the community as well as making profits and not contriving legislation, the people in the firm are more likely to behave in the same way as the leader in that community or in that firm. If you have a CEO that commits insider trading or market manipulation, people in the firm may see this as an opportunity for them to act in the same way because they'll think, well, if the boss is doing it, what is stopping me? So ethics is really a top-down thing that you look at. So I've mentioned here in the slides the King Code, number 4, which we will have a specific lecture on later in the course. So good governance keeps the trust of society and stakeholders. We will also deal with the Financial Advisory and Intermediary Services Act, FIRES, and the main aim of that act is to protect the consumer. Then there are certain codes of conduct as well as the Financial Markets Act, which provides for codes of conduct. So we do go into the Financial Markets Act, FIRES, and King 4. Speaking specifically about the regulation in South Africa, each sector is regulated slightly differently. So if you look at the banks, they are regulated by the Banking Supervision Department, part of the South African Reserve Bank, or the SARB, and they look at the banking activities. So banks need to keep a specific amount of capital, they have to keep their fees to a certain level, and they have to protect their consumers. Non-banking institutions are regulated by the FSCA, which we have discussed. It is independent but accountable to the National Treasury. One of the buzzwords in regulation at the moment is the Twin Peaks model. So what you have here is the SARB, responsible for financial stability, and the Financial Services Conduct Authority will be responsible for the conduct of authorities. Okay, so you have two different institutions, each responsible for different aspects of the legislation. You also have the Financial Intelligence Center. They are responsible for anti-money laundering activities. The National Credit Regulator deals with the National Credit Act. It wants to make sure that people have fair access to credit and that credit industries are not over giving credit to people who cannot afford to pay it back. You have the Financial Services Conduct Authority, which oversees the Ombudsman and administration. And then, as discussed before, you have several self-regulatory organizations. For example, the Stock Exchange.